All right, welcome to week 7. You guys just did exam 1, and we are wasting no time and diving right into our next set of information because we've got a lot of information to cram into your heads this semester. This week we start with biodiversity, and it's actually going to be about a week and a half that we're going to spend covering this because there is quite a bit of material to cover here. So we'll get started here. Before we even begin discussing biodiversity, you need to understand what it is. So if you take that word and break it down, bio means living, diversity means the variety. So we're basically talking about the variety of life on Earth. Now, depending on the area and what you're interested in studying, there are different measurements and different ways that we can measure biodiversity. And you can see that second point there, ecosystems depend on biodiversity because each species has a different role that benefits the whole system. So going back to that information that you already have, each species has a niche. It's very important what it does. And when you lose a certain species or a certain niche, then you've got to get it filled because it has a whole series of chain reactions because of those complex systems that we've learned about. So basically there are 3 different ways that we discuss or talk about biodiversity. There are species diversity, there's genetic diversity, and there's ecosystem diversity. So let's just take a minute to go over the different levels here. Now the first one that's most common, especially in ecology, is species diversity, and this is basically the number or the variety of species in the world or in the particular region or area that you are studying. And there are 2 different measurements that scientists use when dealing with species diversity. There's a species richness, which you're basically going through and counting the total number of different types of species, and it's regardless of how many you have of each one. It's just if you're say surveying a stream and you've got 2 species of frogs and 1 species of salamander, then your species richness for that area is 3. You have 3 different types of species. It doesn't matter if there were 10 of frog A and 2 of frog B and only 1 of a salamander. It's still a species richness of 3 because there's 3 different kinds of species. Now, relative abundance is kind of a different measurement. It takes into account species richness, but it also looks at how common or rare each of those species is relative to the other species in the area. So let's take a look at an example here. So we've got species diversity versus relative abundance, or should say species richness there. Okay, so you've got habitat A and habitat B. Now, if we're going to compare both of these and take a look at them, we see that both of them would have a species diversity or a species richness number of 5. Okay, they both have 5 different species. Each of the species is, each of the individuals is a little circle and they're all colored. So habitat A has a red species, a yellow species, a green species, a blue, and a purple. Same with habitat B. It also has 5 different species. So the species richness for both habitats would be 5. But that still doesn't tell us quite as much as it could about those habitats. So in this case, we might want to look at relative abundance. For habitat A, you can see that the relative abundance numbers are going to be different than habitat B. In habitat A, there are quite a few of the red species. They are very abundant in comparison to the other species found in that habitat. So habitat A, the red species, would have a higher relative abundance number than the yellow, green, blue, or purple species. On the other hand, in habitat B, looking at that relative abundance, each of those species is equally relatively abundant. There are 2 reds, 2 purples, 2 yellows, 2 greens, and 2 blues. So they would all have an equal relative abundance number. And so that tells us quite a bit of difference between the different habitats. So really depends on what you're measuring, and you've got to know what you're looking for and what your area is in to know what kind of measurement you're going to use. But that's kind of the major difference, species richness versus relative abundance. Sorry, I'm not sure what my PowerPoint's doing there. Moving on. Okay, genetic diversity. Well, what is genetic diversity measuring then? Well, basically we're looking at the genetic composition, and so this means that you are looking within a single species or population. You can't compare genetics between different species because it's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't do that. The genetics of an orange are going to be so different than the genetics of an apple. There's no way to compare. So you have to be talking about all apples. And then, you're going to be looking at, well, this apple has, a mutation for being extra juicy, whereas this apple has a genetic mutation for being extra sweet. So that's the differences in DNA. Now, Why would you want high genetic diversity? Well, remember that having those little mutations and the diversity within a population or a species, that allows them to be better able to cope with any environmental change or disease that might come along. It makes them much less vulnerable to those changes. They're able to adapt because it's not going to wipe out all of them. A few of them are going to have some beneficial mutations, be genetically different enough to survive, pass those beneficial genes on, and continue to survive. So that's why you would like higher genetic diversity in general. Okay, finally we have ecosystem diversity. This one you don't really see too much in studies, because most of the time if you're talking ecosystem diversity, you're going to be talking at a fairly large scale. Continents, the world. Not always, though, as we learned, an ecosystem can be the size of a pond of a drop of pond water. So it really depends on where you're looking. But it basically encompasses the differing communities, habitats, takes into account shapes, sizes, how they're connected, all that. So this is looking at the number of different kinds of ecosystems. You know, in our valley, actually, we have very high ecosystem diversity. If you go all the way up to the top of San Jacinto, all the way down to the Salton Sea. I mean, we've got sand dunes, we've got alluvial fans, we've got alpine up at the top of San Jacinto, we have chaparral. We have all these different ecosystems together. We have oases. So we do have quite a bit of diversity, and of course that's because of that steep elevational grade that we have, all the way from over 10,000 feet at the top of San Jacinto down to below 200 feet below sea level at the Salton Sea. That's very rare, by the way. One of the only places in the world you get such a steep descent in such a short distance. Of course, as it would probably seem, biodiversity is not something that's very easy to measure. It's our best guess that there are anywhere from 5 to 30 million species on Earth. So as you can see, best guess 5 to 30, that's not a very narrow range, so we're really not sure. So far, we've only discovered about 1.7 to 2 million species and have identified them and named them, so there's still a lot out there to discover. Remember that the small organisms, those guys are really easily overlooked. So, you know, when we're talking about these species that haven't been discovered, we're not talking about, you know, elephants and giraffes. I mean, it's not likely that there's a species of giraffe or elephant out there that we haven't discovered because they're so big and so easy to see, but different species of fungus and bacteria and little invertebrates, you know, insects, these little tiny microscopic guys, or species that are down deep in the depths of the ocean where we haven't really had a chance to explore, in volcanoes. You know, there's a lot of areas that we haven't closely examined yet. So there's a lot of remote, unexplored areas where probably a lot of these species exist. All right. Let's talk taxonomy for a minute. What is taxonomy? Well, taxonomy is the process of cataloging species and giving them names. So a taxonomist is a scientist who studies species and helps determine whether a new species has been discovered, and then if it has been discovered, they help in naming it. So this often means they have to have a pretty strong genetic background, because a lot of times it comes down to looking at the genetics and saying, are the genetics different enough from this species to consider them two separate species. Taxonomy basically allows us to understand what species are out there. It keeps a whole big, you know, catalog of it and helps us identify those that are most in trouble, and therefore we can go about protecting them. So it's really important to biodiversity. What you need to understand about taxonomy is just the importance to biodiversity, and also mostly how we go about naming species. That's generally what we're referring to when we talk taxonomy in general in ecology, is that naming process. So if you're a scientist out there, say you're hiking around the desert and you come across a tortoise that you think is maybe not a California desert tortoise, it looks really different, and you think, you know, I might just right now have come across a brand new species of tortoise. I don't think anybody's ever seen this tortoise before, and I want to know if it's different. So somehow you would take a sample. You'd either take a blood sample and you take some pictures, or you might bring the specimen in and say if you found it dead or something like that, and bring it to a taxonomist who's going to study it and tell you whether you've discovered a new species or not. And what he's going to do, or she, is first you're going to look at the physical appearance, which is kind of the first outward sign, you know. This tortoise is long and skinny, whereas this one is short and rather oval, so, you know, and the shell colors are different and the scales look different, and it's got a different shaped head, so I think it's a different species. Okay, so physical appearance. Next you're going to go into the genetic makeup, and that's why you need to have that genetics background. They're going to run genetic tests. They're going to look at the different genes and chromosomes and go all the way into that and see if they're different enough to consider them to be different species. And while they're looking at those genetics, they're going to see commonalities and see, what common ancestry do they have, what evolutionary relationships does it seem that there is, where did this species break off from, what's the parent species, etc. So, if it's determined that you have discovered a brand new species, the next step is to give it a name. So we give it a scientific name, and a species scientific name is a two-part Latin name. So the first part of a Latin name is the genus that the species falls under. And a genus is basically a group that species are under, okay? So when you go through the whole taxonomic breakdown, genus is kind of lower down on the chart, getting down to the smaller groups. And it's basically a whole bunch of several different species that all have really common traits. So you'll see an example down here in a second. The second name of a species name is usually a descriptive term. So it's either going to be, of course I'm having a brain fart and I can't think of something off the top of my head, but, sometimes it's like negro, which is black, or sometimes it's a descriptive word that tells you something about it. Sometimes it actually comes from the last name of the person who discovered it because they want to name it after themselves. So a really good example is our local California desert tortoise, and their scientific name is Gophorus agassizii. Now, the Gophorus, that is the genus group that the species falls under, and the genus is the gopher tortoises, and gopher tortoises are any tortoise that live on land and dig burrows. So any of the land tortoises that dig burrows, they're all considered to be in the Gophorus genus. Now the second name is what tells us what the species is. So the second name is that species name. Okay, there's going to be several species that start out Gophorus, but then that second name is going to be different. Now, our local tortoises here were named in honor of this Swiss-American zoologist, and his name, and I'm going to probably totally butcher this name, is Jean-Louis Rodolphe Agassiz. And so they named the Gophorus agassizii tortoise after this guy. So that's how that name came about. So you kind of need to be familiar and generalized with the taxonomic names. So if there's, a species or two that you like, look up the scientific name and learn a little bit about background. Sometimes it can be really interesting. All right, up next we're going to be discussing the benefits of biodiversity, so stay tuned.